Welcome. So this is Mike Carrera with IBM, and today we're going to be talking about the VM Recovery Manager offering at the 1.3 Service Pack 2 level. A new KSYS feature was introduced, so if you've actually listened to my other recordings, you're probably familiar with the concept of that managing LPAR up that I'm showing up on the top right. As of the 1.3 and earlier releases, you could only have one of these guys. So I kind of put the specs as to what I would need in order to manage systems and be able to relocate virtual machines from one system to another. What they introduced in Service Pack 2 is the ability to cluster that cases. So now you can have up to two. If you do that, what the assumption is that you're going to come in and install the PowerHA SystemMirror code. Since this is an AIX instance, you would need at least one license of PowerHA, and you'll also need to provision a cluster-aware AIX LUN. Its minimum size is 512 meg. I happen to provision 1 gig LUNs. And the assumption here is that before I only had one, now if I go ahead and cluster it, I can go ahead and define a second one. So I'm going to go ahead and provision the same exact specs. In my environment, I have two completely separate SANs with block level replication between the two. So I went ahead and I deployed a second KSYS that I'm showing up on the top left. I also provisioned the secondary CAA disk, and he is not shared. I've got the PowerHA cluster software installed, and I'm going to go ahead and cluster the two. So effectively, I'm setting up a KSYS HA pair as I'm reflecting up on the top left. When I go ahead and I do the deploy, what they provide is an actual sample script that does all of the PowerHA setup for you, and it'll allow you to define either a standard cluster or a linked cluster. Being that I'm not going to have any shared disks between the two, I opted to go ahead and have that sample script provision a linked cluster for me. So if you look within the red box, I do have independent base IP addresses. So I don't have a floating service IP address, and the cluster will go ahead and come in and automatically register the two nodes, create logical sites within the cluster definition, and go ahead and do all the setup that it needs to as far as the repository disk is concerned on either site. If I go ahead and I move forward, I'll just kind of show you that when I do the cluster setup, it is very hands-off. So it's going to go ahead and also automatically create a resource group. It calls this resource group KSYS RG, and within it, it's got an application controller. The name is KSYS controller, and effectively what it's doing within the code, if you take a look at the actual start and stop scripts, it's checking that the VM Recovery Manager services are active, and it also goes ahead and establishes one of those KSYS controllers as the actual RSCT domain group leader. So wherever the group leader is, that's where the resource group is going to be hosted. Within the cluster, it's also going to go ahead and provision a startup application monitor, and then it's also going to have a long-running monitor that's performing checks every 30 seconds behind the scenes. So again, if you were deploying a general cluster and doing it step by step, you would have to do all those things yourself. In this type of configuration, it is very hands-off in the sense that provided sample script does all of this for you. Some of the pre-setup that you need to consider: before the KSYS configuration is in place, the PowerHA cluster actually has to be configured. So that is a little bit different. If you had an existing KSYS cluster configuration, you'd have to remove it, deploy the HA cluster, and when you do that, run that sample script, it's going to go ahead and not only set up the HA cluster with all the components that I already mentioned, but it's also going to set up the KSYS cluster name. From there on out, you will have to go ahead and do the remaining KSYS configuration steps, and I'll kind of show you the flow in just a little bit. So one of the assumptions is that I'm going to have an AIX KSYS LPAR on one side, AIX KSYS LPAR on the other side, and it's going to have the VM Recovery Manager and the PowerHA code installed. I am going to set up a repository disk, only a single shared one if it's a standard cluster, or one per site. In my configuration, you'll see that I did one on the left side, one on the right side, and that's why I elected that sample script to go ahead and configure a linked cluster for me. And then I do have to do configuration like I did before with standalone PowerHA clusters, where I set up the etc host file and I defined the base IP address for both of the nodes, also the etc cluster rhost file. And then there is an extra attribute that I do need to go ahead and export. So I'm going to go ahead and set them up in the dot profile on all of the nodes, and I'm going to make sure that it's actually exported out. So that CT management scope must be set to equal to. The sample script is located in opt IBM cases samples /PHA, and I'll show you in just a little bit when I do the actual deploy. And you'll see that PowerHA cases setup, when I launch it, he's going to automatically launch a small menu. I'll take you through the guided approach, and it's going to ask you, do you want a standard cluster or linked? And I already mentioned that I elected to have it set up a linked cluster, which effectively looks something along the lines as to what I loaded on the bottom. So base IP address on the left with a corresponding repository disk, base IP address on the right with its corresponding repository disk. And when it does the actual setup, I started probing around. It automatically sets up logical site names. I didn't get to pick the names, but you'll notice that on the left-hand side, I've got site 1. On the right side, I've got site 2. And you'll see that the node list, it was ATSSG in my environment 189. And then on the right-hand side, the actual node is ATSSG 199. Okay, so now that I showed you logically in the beginning part of this recording what the configuration was going to look like with two KSYS instances that are going to be clustered with the PowerHA software, I went ahead and I opened up terminal sessions onto each one of them. So on the top I've got a connection to the 189 LPAR, and then on the bottom I've got a connection to the 199 LPAR. Both should be identical. And if I just do an OS level, I'll just show you that I'm playing with AIX7 2TL3, and then I've already taken advantage and installed the PowerHA software. If I just simply query the environment, there is no cluster configuration in place. The sample script is going to go ahead and do that for me. And then if I do a KSYS manager Q KSYS cluster, obviously there's no KSYS configuration. I mentioned already that in the preparation steps that the PowerHA cluster needs to be defined first, and it will go ahead and create the KSYS manager cluster for you. They are going to share the same name, so when you go ahead and run the actual sample script, pay attention to what node you invoke it from, because it'll take the name of the 189 LPAR or the name of the 199 LPAR depending on where I go ahead and I invoke the sample script from. In the meantime, I did go ahead and update my etc host file. It looks identical on both nodes, but it's super simple. It's just the base IP address of node 1 and node 2. I did create the etc cluster R host file, which makes the PowerHA software happy. And you'll notice that it's the same exact thing. It's just the base IP addresses. And the file looks identical on the 199 node on the bottom. Beyond that, there is a required environment variable that needs to be exported. So if we go ahead and take a quick look, it is CT management scope, and you want them to be exported out to the number 2. So update the dot profile on node 1, update the profile or dot profile file on node 2, and then make sure that this environment variable is always set to 2. And now that I've got that, let's go and cd into opt IBM KSYS. Within here, they have added a samples directory. And then if we take a look, notice that there's a PowerHA subdirectory. And in here, you'll notice that it's got some scripts. Here is the sample configuration script. So I'm going to go ahead and invoke them. And when I run this, it should basically just be a quick guided menu and do all of the setup for me. So notice that it's asking me, what type of PowerHA cluster do you need? Do you need a standard one that has a shared disk for the repository? Or do you have 2 independent repository disks? And it'll go ahead and create a linked cluster for you. So I happen to have the two unshared ones. So completely independent. And here are the names of my KSYS LPARs, and you can see them in the windows above. So ATSSG 189 is going to be bound to site 1. I don't get to pick the actual site names. Those are logical site names in PowerHA. And then I know that there is LUNs already provisioned in each one. And on site 2, I'm going to use 199, which was the name of that one. And since I know that there's only 2 disks, I'll go ahead and I'll specify HDisk1, and from here on out it's going to go ahead and do the remainder of the configuration. It's going to detect that there's no cluster defined, and from there it's going to define sites, specify a linked cluster, automatically create the resource group for you, and within that resource group is going to have an application server with corresponding scripts. It is going to define application monitors from the get-go, so it's going to define a startup monitor and a long-running monitor, and it's also going to go ahead and define a file collection, and that file collection is going to maintain a KSYS XML file behind the scenes automatically. So anytime that file changes, it'll make sure that it maintains the file in sync between the two members. And right here you see the HDisk that I was using was HDisk 1. I'll just go ahead and take advantage and show you that it was a 1 gig LUN. Now it's going to go ahead and keep chugging along. The entire operation takes close to maybe 2 minutes, maybe a little less. And when it actually completes, it leaves everything ready to go. It's going to start up cluster services on both sides, and it's going to stand up the resource group that's maintaining the RSCT peer domain between the two cluster members. So I'll go ahead and let it chug along. I'll speed up the recording so we don't have to sit and watch every single itemized step. And then when it completes, I'll go ahead and I'll resume and I'll show you a few more things. And as you probably just saw, the script itself actually just completed. It's still doing a little bit of orchestrating behind the scenes. If I was tailing the logs, you could see that it's setting the RSCT peer domain, and it's going to go ahead and set one side to become the actual group leader. While it's doing that particular piece, I'll show you a couple things. And if I do a CL show res, which is one of the legacy PowerHA commands, you'll notice that it created a resource group called KSYS RG. It went ahead and it snagged up the two participating nodes, and notice that it set the startup policy to online and first available node, because ultimately it doesn't matter which of the HA nodes is the actual active KSYS cluster member or the group leader. Wherever the resource group is hosted, he's going to be the leader, but you can invoke the KSYS manager operations from either one of the nodes. And then beyond this, the script that it's actually using to go ahead and maintain that group leader is right here, KSYS controller, application controller that got defined within the cluster. I'll show you what those scripts actually look like. And if I do a CL Manager Q app, you'll notice that there's the name of the actual KSYS controller. I can do the same thing and do Q app CTR LER, and it'll go ahead and show us the actual details. So notice that its name is KSYS controller. It's got two corresponding application monitors behind the scenes, and it automatically went ahead and created application start scripts and stop scripts. Then I can show you currently the resource group is online on node 189, so ultimately he should be the group leader. I have a feeling he might actually change by the time I finish here, but let's go ahead and do Q monitor, so you'll see the same exact thing. Those are the now existing application monitors that were automatically created. There's a long-running monitor and a startup monitor. The startup would be a one-time run, and if I get the expanded view, KSYS mon long run, so it'll give me the details for that long-running monitor. You'll see that it's bound to the actual application controller that it created. Its mode is a long-running monitor, and then notice that it's a monitor interval of every 30 seconds it'll be performing a check, and then it's got a few different scripts that it's going to go ahead and leverage. So it's going to stop that KSYS controller application controller, or restart it if it detects that there's some type of failure. Otherwise, it'll automatically relocate from one PowerHA node to the other PowerHA node and make that new target the actual group leader. Another line item that it went ahead and added is, by default, you always get two default file collections. Normally those guys are disabled, and then it did go ahead and create one called KSYS files. So what it's doing is it's going to go ahead and ensure that all of the scripts that it provisioned for you in the sample script are maintained across all of the KSYS cluster members. So let's see what it's actually doing in KSYS files. And if we take a look, notice that every time that the cluster is synchronized, it's going to go ahead and make sure that they're in sync. But also when those files are changed, it'll automatically ensure, hey, a change was detected on this node. Make sure that it's propagated and kept in sync on the remaining cluster member. It is maintaining the long-running monitor, the startup monitor. Here you see the start script and the corresponding stop script. And here is the actual KSYS Manager XML file that is being maintained between the actual cluster members. Let's do one more peek. And as I suspected, while it was kind of establishing things behind the scenes, it went ahead and it relocated the resource group. It's currently online on 199. If I just do a quick check, LSSRC-LS on IBM VMR, and it's a much longer output, but if I just take a look at who the group leader is, you'll see that ATS 199, the node that I'm actually on, is the one that's actually the group leader. And because this is a PowerHA cluster, I can precede my command with the cluster command, and it's going to go ahead and run it on both. So the other node also thinks that the group leader is 199. Again, it should follow wherever the resource group is actually hosted, and since it's online on the 199 node, that is the actual corresponding group leader. Last couple pieces, if I do a seal manager query cluster, which is a PowerHA command, this should be giving me a bunch of output about the cluster name that it defined and a bunch of its corresponding attributes. But notice that because I ran the actual sample script to provide the configuration for me, on the 199 node, it named the cluster ATSSG199 underscore cluster. Had I run that script on the 189 node, it would have acquired the 189 underscore cluster name. So that's about as far as you can go in this particular release with getting to pick the name, whatever node you invoke it from. The other thing that it went ahead and did is if I query the cluster name for the KSYS manager, this one's slightly different as far as the syntax, but notice that it went ahead and automatically created the KSYS cluster for me. So it keeps those two names in sync. It's automatically online and it's set to be type DR, but those two names will be matched. Now that the PowerHA cluster has been laid down and everything is stable, I can now proceed and do the traditional KSYS cluster configuration where I start defining the HMCs, the storage agents, pairing up the hosts, managing and unmanaging the VMs, and then perform operations if I choose to do so. So I'll show you a few more things, but configuration-wise, you see that it was a super easy deploy. Okay, so now that I showed you the configuration, what are you left with? So I kind of already showed you the cluster name, node names, all the resource groups, and additional highly available resources that got automatically configured for you. So the sample script did go ahead and provision all of those guys, and it also created the actual KSYS cluster name. It matched up the PowerHA cluster name along with the KSYS cluster name, and it brought the KSYS services online. So IBM.VMR is actually active on both sides. And now what I do have to do is I still have to go ahead and proceed and go through the actual KSYS configurations. So I can start defining the storage agents, HMCs, hosts, define the host pairs. That piece is going to pretty much be up to me. And I can, I guess, opt to do it via one of the UI servers, or I can do it via CLI. What I elected to do is, rather than take you step by step and make the video much longer, I went ahead and I just gave you the Cliff Note version, showing you the steps that I would use in my configuration. So step one, the cluster name is already pre-configured by that sample script. The site definitions, there was a slight change. So if you look in the Service Pack 2, KSYS Manager add site primary, the site type is now home instead of active. So if you have any notes from prior releases, you may have to update the notes. And I changed the replication type to sync because the default is always async. Now that I defined the actual sites, I started defining the HMCs. That's business as usual. Syntactically, the only thing that's different is my password. I nixed that out of the Cliff Note version. And then I defined the hosts themselves. Those HMCs do manage multiple hosts, so you can do a KSYS Manager query HMC to see the hosts that are being managed. I know I'm playing with a pair of S822s, so I bound the first S822 to the primary site, the second one to the secondary site, and then I paired up the two hosts. And then I went ahead and I added each of the storage subsystems. I am playing with storewise storage. And one of the things to note here is that since now you're playing with two KSYS managers, the public key when you set up the SSH connection is a point-to-point connection or mapping. So what I had to do, since each of the cases would effectively wind up having its own public key, is I had to copy both the private and the public key to exist or be the same across the two KSYS controllers. So that way, both of the KSYS controllers will register connectivity to each of the storage subsystems. So just pay attention to that piece since you're adding a second KSYS managing LPAR. Another new step is in the prior releases, the default host group got created and automatically allocated the host to it. In this instance, when I checked, it does create the default host group, but it does not automatically take those hosts and have them assigned to it. So I had to do a KSYS manager modify my host group, and I guess I could have called or created a brand new host group with its own name, but I added the two hosts that were defined, and I said that the host group was going to live on the primary site. Beyond that, because my environment has the KSYS management LPAR on one of the SA22s, or both of them actually, but they're split up, the host group resides on the system on the primary site on the left-hand side, and my KSYS managing LPAR is ATSSG 189. So I did go ahead and unmanage him, and then I added my notification messaging just so I get emails in the event that anything occurs. And then from there, I did the discovery with the verification with the second to last step. So you'll notice that I removed the KSYS managed VM. I added my email notification. I did the VM discovery and verification. And the reason I unmanaged the KSYS controller is that I don't want to have to do it twice. If I had run the discovery first, I would have had to unmanage the KSYS controller, and then I would have had to rerun the discovery, which would have extended the amount of time that this took. After this step, I can go ahead and perform planned moves, unplanned moves, and perform other operations. But I've pretty much taken care of the actual entire cluster configuration as far as the KSYS is concerned. The PowerHA piece was taken care of for me in the sample scripts. The only additional thing that I would have had to do was install the UI server code. And there is one additional consideration that you should probably pay attention to. Because you have a clustered configuration, you don't want to have two separate UI servers running. So I'll show you what that looks like in just a sec. And the sample script and the cluster configuration does not accommodate for that piece today. So some of the observations: you can execute the KSYS manager commands from either of the KSYS controllers, so that's kind of nice. It doesn't matter which one you're on, even though under the covers one of them will actually be the group leader. And then if you wanted to check who the group leader was, syntactically, I can do the cluster command from either one of the nodes, and it'll invoke the operation on both. That is what the application controller start logic is actually doing. It's setting the group leader, and it's kind of maintaining consistency between them. And you'll notice that wherever the resource group is, that KSYS RG, that is where the group leader is actually going to be. If you notice during the actual deploy, I didn't get to pick any of my names. So the cluster name was set for me, the KSYS cluster name, the HA site names, the resource group, all those things. You kind of have to walk away from making modifications, at least at this release. And then I did do a little bit of testing where I started halting nodes, and I took the group leader node and I halted him, and I saw everything move, within seconds, which was nice. But I noticed that PowerHA cluster services did not automatically restart after halting that KSYS LPAR. So pay attention to that piece. After that node was it came back online, you may have to do the seal manager start services on that node, which is no big deal, but just kind of as an FYI. I mentioned this earlier on. I said that the active UI server should only run on one of the cases at a time. Ultimately, you want to have that UI server running on the node with the group leader. So what I'm going to do in my environment is that I'm going to go ahead and customize some of the scripts so that whenever there's a failover, it automatically starts up the UI server services. And ideally, if you look at the bottom half, that's business as usual. I've got the two KSYS sites, I've got the host pairing, and then the block level replication taking place. And on the top side, I've got the PowerHA linked cluster that's effectively maintaining who the group leader is. But in addition to that, if you install the UI server code, feel free to install it on both, but make sure that it's actively running like I'm showing up on the top right on the node that happens to be the group leader, and that those services are not active on the other KSYS controller, so that you always have it follow wherever the resource group is. In a follow-on release, I suspect that they'll have that UI server automatically managed for you as well. But again, just as another FYI. The last piece that I'll show you is they did introduce some administrative controls from the UI server in the Service Pack 2 update. So I'll just kind of give you a quick glimpse of that, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. So the last piece that I wanted to leave you with is I connected to the UI server on the 199 node, the actual group leader. And here's the entry point. I'm going to go ahead and log in. And you'll notice that in Service Pack 2, it looks slightly different. The nice thing is that they went ahead and they added the administrative controls for some of the functions. So you'll see that in just a sec as it's loading the actual configuration. So if you look up on the top left, you see that the name of the cluster that was configured by that PowerHA sample script, where it matched the KSYS cluster name, is up there. So ATSSG 199 underscore cluster. Here are the name of the sites that I defined. So here's the primary site, and the big addition that I wanted to highlight is the fact that the DR test feature administrative function is now there, and then you also have the ability to initiate a site move through the GUI. Before it was only CLI based, and you can decide whether it's going to be a planned move, unplanned, if you want to force it or not force it, and you can do it at the site level, or you can also do it at the resource group level. So in my environment, I happen to have just a single pair of systems, so it doesn't matter if I'm just using the default host group, or if I was performing a site move. But the nice thing is that you can easily see that the host group is currently being hosted on the primary site. The host group is also visible on the secondary site, which you see here secondary, but it's grayed out. And you have the ability to perform the movement operation at the host group level as well. So if I had multiple host pairings and I had defined individual host groups, I could perform those operations via the GUI as well. So I could do a planned move and go ahead and initiate it through the user interface. So I won't get into too many details here. They did add a few nice enhancements, like through the storage controllers, seeing the way that the volumes are being replicated, the direction, and the participating UUIDs. We can do a separate recording on that particular piece. The biggest thing was who's going to host the UI server. You want him to go ahead and follow the group leader in a clustered KSYS configuration. So I'll go ahead and I'll wrap up. Thank you for listening. And at the beginning of the recording, I shared my personal email address, but product-wise, if you have any feedback for a development team or any thoughts on the product, that is the general email address where you can go ahead and send feedback or suggestions or even ask questions. So if you send a note to gdr@us.ibm.com, you should get a response from a number of various resources. Thanks for listening.